Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio from Monday, July 1st, 2024. The Supreme Court rules that former presidents have immunity from prosecution for official actions while in office, but not for unofficial actions. High Court said that lower courts must now decide which category former President Donald Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 presidential election, for which he's been charged, fall into. Coming up, we'll get reaction to the decision from members of Congress and talk with The Hill's legal affairs reporter Zach Schoenfeld. Former Trump White House senior advisor Steve Bannon reports to a federal prison in Connecticut to begin serving a 4-month prison sentence for contempt of Congress for not responding to a subpoena from the January 6th Committee for Testimony and Records. He tells reporters and supporters before going in that he's proud to go to prison if this is what it takes to stand up to tyranny, and calls himself a political prisoner. President Joe Biden returning to the White House from Camp David tonight after weekend meetings in which he reportedly discussed the future of his re-election campaign after last week's debate performance against former President Trump. We'll hear from Ipsos pollster Clifford Young on who the public thinks won that debate and their views of each candidate's mental fitness. Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su talks about the changes in overtime rules that the Biden administration says will make 1 million more workers eligible for overtime pay. In France, right-wing National Rally Party does well in the first round of voting. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken asked at an event in Washington what this may mean for U.S.-European relations and the future of the NATO military alliance. And the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, is asked about Donald Trump's promise to end the war between Russia and Ukraine in one day. Story from NBC News. The Supreme Court on Monday raised the bar for prosecuting Donald Trump, ruling that he has immunity for some of his conduct as president in his federal election interference case, but maybe not for other actions, adding another obstacle for special counsel Jack Smith taking the case to trial. In a novel and potentially consequential case on the limits of presidential power, the justices voted 6-3 along ideological lines to reject Trump's broad claim of immunity, meaning the charges related to his attempt to overturn the 2020 election results will not be dismissed, but said some actions closely related to his core duties as president are off limits to prosecutors. That was from NBC News. Former President Trump putting out a statement to Fox News Digital that reads, "I have been harassed by the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, Obama, and their thugs, fascists, and communists for years, and now the courts have spoken. This is a big win for our Constitution and our democracy. Now I'm free to campaign like anyone else. We are leading in every poll by a lot, and we'll make America great again." And a supporter of Donald Trump, Sen Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, reacted on Steve Bannon's podcast, War Room.
I think it's good news. The question I would have is, they say official acts will be immune. Was the speech on January 6th an official act? I think that's probably going to go back to the original court to make that decision. Is that correct?
I think we're going to determine that. I'm going to get Mike Davis to break it down, but I think that's right. So it's absolute immunity for official acts and then a no immunity for unofficial acts. So that's going to have to be, we're going to break that down today. And you think that's, in your mind, that's a question?
Well, I think probably it's a good decision, it sounds like, but my guess is, and this is what they've been saying and now analyzing this before the decision came out, was in all likelihood it goes back to the original court with jurisdiction now to decide whether or not what was and what was not official action. So it's a good step forward saying official actions are immune from prosecution. But, there's a real debate. I have it all the time. When I give a speech, is it a political speech or is it a partisan speech or is it part of my official duties? Because my official duties are speaking and speaking to the public. Not always the national public, but speaking to people in Kentucky, speaking on the radio. What I'm doing right now, is this an official act of my office being on your program? I'm being interviewed as a senator and talked to or asked about, opinions on public policy. I would think this is an official activity, but that's what the real question is going to be, is deciding the facts. Was the speech on January 6th an official act? And I think speeches by the president would be official acts.
Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, on Steve Bannon's podcast today. The Joe Biden re-election campaign putting out a statement. Today's ruling doesn't change the facts, so let's be very clear about what happened on January 6th. Donald Trump snapped after he lost the 2020 election and encouraged the mob to overthrow the results of a free and fair election. Trump is already running for president as a convicted felon for the very same reason he sat idly by while the mob violently attacked the Capitol. He thinks he's above the law and is willing to do anything to gain and hold onto power for himself. That was the statement from the Biden-Harris campaign. Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat from California, who is a member of the committee that investigated the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, posted a video.
We have some breaking news on Donald Trump and his legal problems. Just a few hours ago, the Supreme Court ruled on whether Donald Trump is immune from prosecution on charges relating to his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And they released a shocking and destructive decision. Donald Trump will have immunity for official acts, an astonishing decision that validates the former president's attempts to undermine our democracy, and one that flies in the face of our founding principles and the idea that no one, not even the president, is above the law. If leaders can be immune from liability for criminal acts while in office, designed to overturn a free and fair election, that might very well be the end of our republic. Holding leaders accountable, no matter what office they hold, is the hallmark of every strong and healthy democracy. But this partisan Supreme Court just doesn't care. Our country is in grave danger if we allow any president to stay in power after losing and be held immune from legal consequence. What's clear is that the first and last line of defense for our democracy will be the ballot box, not the courts. This November, we must put an end to Trump's dictatorial ambitions once and for all.
Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat from California, in a video post. Zach Schoenfeld, courts and legal reporter for The Hill, joins us now to discuss the Supreme Court's decision in Trump v. U.S. on presidential immunity. Thanks again for being with us. Your article at thehill.com lists 5 takeaways. Let's run through them. Number 1, justices grant broad immunity.
Yeah, this is a pretty broad shield for former President Trump, especially after he was appealing this issue, saying that he was immune for all official acts while in office, and lower courts had just flatly rejected that theory. Today, the Supreme Court essentially put presidential conduct into 3 different buckets with different levels of immunity for each. The first bucket is core constitutional powers. They said when the president is acting in his core authority that he is immune from those actions. Then they said there's a second bucket of other official acts. They said those are at least presumptively immune. They said maybe they're totally immune, but at least for the purposes of this case, they're presumptively immune. And then, of course, there's a third bucket of unofficial conduct that everyone has always agreed there is no immunity shield for and can be prosecuted. So today, it certainly seems that it's going to narrow the types of conduct that former President Trump can be criminally prosecuted for.
And the second takeaway, and I'm going to use the line right from the article, decision takes a sledgehammer to Trump's indictment.
Yeah, that gets into what I was just getting to there at the end of the last question, and that is the fact that if you go through the allegations in Donald Trump's indictment, the justices actually got into it a little bit. They didn't, they're leaving it for a lower court to decide these final questions of whether each specific allegation, line by line, is an official act or which of these buckets it falls into. But they did give some guidance. So, for example, they said all of these allegations about how Trump was talking about with different Justice Department officials following the 2020 election, they said that is conduct that is clearly immune. But what they also gave guidance on is they said all of that pressure campaign on Vice President Mike Pence in the lead up to January 6th, they're saying that very well could be still prosecuted and isn't immune under their new test. So leaving it with some pretty big questions for a lower court.
The decision was 6-3, and point number 3 in your 5 takeaways, dissent accuses majority of reshaping the presidency. I would say the language is a little bit stronger than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Justice Sotomayor's opinion, who wrote the principal dissent in this decision, certainly mincing no words, saying that the majority was reshaping the institute of the presidency, bringing up many of those extreme hypotheticals that we've seen thrown around during this case, chief among them, whether the president is immune if he orders SEAL Team 6 to go assassinate his political rival. Sotomayor, in her view, thinks that the majority's test today allows him to have immunity. Now, I think the majority, might disagree with that potentially, doesn't have a square resolution on that, but really getting into what she says is essentially making the president above the law. And another thing that was interesting was that she read her dissent from the bench. This is a rare occurrence. It only happens a few times a term, and it's reserved for when a justice really wants to underscore how stark their disagreements are. And Sotomayor reserved that for today's immunity case.
We're talking with the Hill's courts and legal reporter, Zach Schoenfeld. At number 4 on the list, remand will kick the case beyond the election. That's the Trump case.
Yeah, this was this appeal in his D.C. criminal indictment where he's charged on 4 felony counts of conspiring to subvert the 2020 election. We've been talking about, how there's still issues to come, this lower court battle where they're going to have to figure out, his trial judge, whether these specific allegations, line by line in this indictment, can still go to trial or whether they fall under this new immunity shield that was carved out by the Supreme Court. And, whichever way it ultimately shakes out on the merits, this is going to give Trump an easy pathway to put his trial past November's election. But that's not to say that we're not going to get a series of blockbuster evidentiary hearings that could almost feel like a mini trial as we try to sort out these remaining questions over immunity. But it does seem that there's really no chance for this case to get to a jury before November.
And the fifth takeaway, ruling falling along ideological lines, I guess a little surprised there.
Yeah, a little surprised there after the oral arguments that we saw in April. This opinion was pretty lined up for what it seemed the justices were aligning to in April, and that is along these familiar 6-3 ideological lines with the conservatives in the majority and then the 3 liberal justices in dissent. Now, that's not to say that they haven't had plenty of unanimous cases. About half of their cases this term were unanimous. Only 11 of their 59 opinions this term were along those 6-3 ideological lines. But if you go through a lot of their big cases this term, including this immunity case, it was that 6-3 ideological line. So I think in many ways that's a big loss for Chief Justice John Roberts, someone who has really tried to keep the Supreme Court above the political fray, especially in these cases involving Trump. But it seems with the decision today, he couldn't prevent the court from splitting along its familiar lines.
And final question, during the oral argument, Justice Neil Gorsuch famously said, "We're writing a rule for the ages." And you were in the courtroom today when the opinion was released. You were posting about it. Did it feel like that, like it was a momentous decision?
Yeah, I think that, the momentous decision was really lost on no one. Now, I will clarify, I was downstairs listening over an audio feed for what was happening upstairs in the courtroom as I was getting handed that opinion in writing. But I could hear the justices reading these opinions on the bench, the emotion in Sotomayor as she was really powerfully reading this forceful dissent, saying that the majority is reshaping the face of the presidency. So I think this was lost on none of the 9 justices today of the momentous nature of this opinion. But that being said, my colleague who was in the courtroom said that as Sotomayor was reading that dissent, she kept looking over to Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion today. But the Chief Justice never returned that gaze.
Zach Schoenfeld, courts and legal reporter for The Hill. You can find his article at thehill.com. Thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, posting on X, "This is a sad day for America, a sad day for our democracy. The very basis of our judicial system is that no one is above the law. Treason or incitement of an insurrection should not be considered a core constitutional power afforded to a president." The Senator Schumer also posting this disgraceful decision by the MAGA SCOTUS, which is comprised of 3 justices appointed by Trump himself, enables the former president to weaken our democracy by breaking the law. It undermines SCOTUS's credibility and suggests political influence trumps all in our courts today. Congressman James Comr, Republican from Kentucky, chair of the Oversight and Accountability Committee, was interviewed on Fox News.
Well, I think this was the right decision. I think this is a win for the American people. Now, the American people can focus on the real issues at hand and who they want to lead America over the next 4 years instead of worrying about what a court was going to rule against Donald Trump or over some trivial or over politicized issue. I think that for future presidencies, they don't need to constantly worry about decisions that they have to make that could be in the best interest of the American people. They can't. They shouldn't have to worry about prosecution when they leave office. So, we need checks and balances in our system, just like I said earlier. But the problem is the Democrats have abused every safety valve we have in our form of government. They've over-politicized everything. Their hatred towards Donald Trump has led them to have a primary election where they wouldn't let anyone in. They ran out quality candidates like Robert F. Kennedy to ensure that Joe Biden got the nomination. They've held Donald Trump. They've tried to get him kicked off the ballot. They've tried to expend all of his campaign funds defending himself in all these lower courts. Now, the reason the American people are winners is these lower courts can go back to what they're supposed to do and go after the bad guys. Instead of trying to go after political opponents, go after the carjackers and the rapists and the murderers. Go after the criminals and let the American people decide who's going to be the next president of the United States.
Congressman James Comr, Republican from Kentucky, chair of the Oversight Committee, interviewed on Fox News today about the Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity. More reactions. Senator John Barrasso, Republican from Wyoming, wrote that the decision is another victory for democracy and the rule of law against Democrat lawlessness. He said Joe Biden and the Democrats are weaponizing the justice system because they know President Trump will beat them in November. President Trump has rightly pursued all legal channels to stop Democrats' political prosecutions. And Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Democrat from New York, wrote on X, today's ruling represents an assault on American democracy. It's up to Congress to defend our nation from this authoritarian capture. I intend on filing articles of impeachment upon our return, referring to justices. A panel of columnists talked about the presidential immunity decision today at Georgetown University Law School in Washington. Here are Jamelle Bouie from the New York Times and Maura Donegan from The Guardian.
It's no accident that Roberts was in the Reagan OLC, Alito was in the Reagan OLC, Kavanaugh worked for W. Like, these are people who came up through the Republican legal movement at the time when the unitary executive notion was being developed and put forward. And this, to me, is just sort of a constitutional ratification of the notion of a unitary executive. And I really want to hammer in on how it represents a fundamental break with what the presidency was designed to be in 1787 and 1788. It was a legitimate concern among the people who opposed ratification of the Constitution that they were creating that they were creating a king. This was a real fear. And one of the things that advocates for ratification said again and again and again at ratification conventions, in presses, everywhere they had to make this argument. They were like, no, the president can be criminally prosecuted. One of these guys at the North Carolina ratification convention even went as far as to say that not only can the president be criminally prosecuted, but if it's a capital offense, you can execute him.
Not cited today.
The framers or the ratifiers were very clear about this. And so this idea that there's even a real distinction between official and unofficial acts is completely extra-constitutional. It doesn't exist. It's something that's been made up to deal with the fact that basically since the Second World War, the president has acquired vast extra-constitutional powers that do make him criminally liable when he exercises them. And this court has just said, not only we're not going to do anything to push back on that, but we're going to formalize it and effectively say that the president, what can't the president do under this dispensation? Like, really, what can't the president do?
When you're president, they let you do it.
Right.
Or if the president...
Whoa.
If the president does it, it's not illegal. That was my favorite. I want to echo Jamel's point that this is like the capstone of a long historical project to transform the presidency, but I don't think we can really understate what the court did to the executive institution today. It is a different office today than it was, just a few hours ago. I think, not to put too fine a point on it, but I think they did this out of deference to Trump and in anticipation of Trump's future actions in what they are hoping and expecting will be a second Trump term beginning in January.
Maura Donegan, U.S. columnist for The Guardian, and before that, Jamelle Bouie, opinion columnist for The New York Times, on a panel at Georgetown University Law School in Washington, the day at the school looking at the review of the Supreme Court term. You can find video of those panels at our website, cspan.org. And this was the final day of the Supreme Court to release its opinions for the term. A few other cases, as reported by Associated Press, the Supreme Court on Monday kept a hold on efforts in Texas and Florida to limit how Facebook, TikTok, X, YouTube, and other social media platforms regulate content posted by their users. The justice returned the cases to lower courts in challenges from trade organizations for the companies. While the details vary, both laws aim to address conservative complaints that the social media companies were liberal-leaning and censored users based on their viewpoints, especially on the political right. And also, the Supreme Court opened the door Monday to new broad challenges to regulations long after they take effect, the third blow in a week to federal agencies. A justice ruled 6-3 in favor of a truck stop in North Dakota that wants to sue over a regulation on debit card swipe fees that the Federal Appeals Court in Washington upheld 10 years ago. Federal law sets a 6-year deadline for broad challenges to regulations. The deadline for lawsuits over the regulation was in 2017. Corner Post, the truck stop in Watford City in western North Dakota, didn't open its doors until 2018. That was from Associated Press. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, writes ABC News, surrendered on Monday to law enforcement to begin his 4-month prison sentence for contempt of Congress. He entered the Federal Correctional Institute in Danbury, Connecticut, shortly before noon to begin serving his sentence. Bannon was sentenced to 4 months in October 2022 after he was found guilty of defying a subpoena from the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. That was from ABC News. Steve Bannon spoke to reporters across the street from the prison before he surrendered.
I asked for Danbury for a very specific reason. Back in the only other person that's ever been sent to prison for a congressional subpoena, not going to a House subpoena, for contempt, held in contempt, was Ring Lardner Jr. Back in the 1940s, during the House Un-American Activity investigation, Columbia Studio fired him, because of his political beliefs. And then he was found guilty. They sent it to the DOJ. He was sent to prison. He was sent to this prison. That's why I requested Danbury, because there's no difference in his fight than in our fight. I'm a political prisoner of Nancy Pelosi. I'm a political prisoner of Merrick Garland. I'm a political prisoner of Joe Biden and the corrupt Biden establishment. And you saw on Thursday all the lies that they told, right? All the lies they told. Any group that would sit there and lie to you about the shape of the President of the United States with the national security element of that, lied about the 2020 election, they've lied about COVID, they've lied about everything that they've done to the American people, and they're not going to stop. Until we stop them, they're not going to stop. And the way you stop them is you do things that says, hey, if they're going to send me to prison, it's not going to matter if we take this fight and take it up the next level, okay? Anybody from the press have a question? Is that Sarah Murray of CNN? I don't want to talk about my conversations with the president, but I think you can see on his Truth Social, he's very supportive. And remember, the most important thing, that was Sarah Murray, the great CNN reporter. Sarah, the most important thing to remember is President Trump is going to be sentenced to prison on July 11th. Me going here for 4 months is nothing. They're going in a very sham trial, totally illegal. They are going to sentence Donald J. Trump, the greatest president of the 20th and 21st century, to prison in a sham trial in New York on July 11th. So I know he supports this.
Steve Bannon, former White House senior advisor in the Trump administration, at a news conference on the side of the road outside the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, before he surrendered to begin his 4-month sentence for contempt of Congress, defying a subpoena in the January 6th investigation. From Associated Press, defense attorneys have argued the case raises issues that should be examined by the Supreme Court, including Bannon's previous lawyer's belief that the subpoena was invalid because Trump had asserted executive privilege. Prosecutors, though, say Bannon had left the White House years before and Trump had never invoked executive privilege in front of the committee. Story from Axios: a massive political, PR, and personal campaign is underway to reject calls for President Biden to drop his re-election race and rally Democrats to move on from public debate about age and his future. Top officials tell us Biden has zero interest in stepping aside, and First Lady Jill Biden and key family members and friends agree, according to people who talk regularly with them. Biden, who has ducked tough interviews and avoided no-holds-barred press conferences, is now considering both Look for a town hall or a big one-on-one interview this month. That was the reporting from Axios. This comes after last week's presidential debate between President Biden and former President Trump. C-SPAN spoke with Clifford Young, president of Ipsos Polling and Societal Trends, about public reaction to that debate.
Majority of likely voters who watched the debate say the former president performed better than President Biden. 60% said that the former president performed better.
Yeah, 60 versus 20 that thought thought Biden did better. That's unprecedented. Usually debates are fuzzy at best. They really don't define things. They might tweak the numbers a bit on the margins, but usually it's a wash. That's our experience, historically speaking. This was an important debate. We knew that going in. Biden had to show himself to be competent, to be fit, as I already mentioned. And the polling's very clear. He lost that. He did not perform well, and he did not deliver on that specific need.
Do those numbers change as the weeks go by and we get farther away from the debate?
Yes, and so it's not about watching the debate, it's about the spin after the debate and how that is socialized at a national level. And so it's a wait and see right now. Really what we have to do is wait and see how the polls on the horse race, the polls on approval rating in respect to Biden perform. But yes, it is a slow process that takes time to work its way through.
Are the polls impacted by the media coverage following the debate? The President Biden's campaign says in a letter, in an email to donors, that they believe it will be, that there's this frenzy by the media now to ask this question and continually have stories about President Biden's mental fitness.
They're right and they're wrong. And so they're right in the sense, in the short term, often we call these media effects. And so it's the tone or the tenor of the media at that given time. It can have a positive or negative impact. But ultimately, the numbers regress back to whatever the norm or the mean should be. If he performed poorly, it's going to have a negative impact long term. If it's a net kind of wash, there'll be any sort of negative effect will disappear, and we really have to wait and see. But I think there's going to be a negative impact. It really was historical and unprecedented. His performance, the numbers suggest that.
Democrats who are worried say they respond to that from supporters of the president and say Americans cannot unsee what they saw Thursday night.
Yeah, we will see, right? We will see in the numbers. We have to wait and see what comes out of the polls. But from an intrinsic perspective, that was a poor performance on an issue that was one of his central Achilles heels, which was competence and fitness. It is difficult to unknow that.
Let's talk about that. Here is your pre-debate poll. Mr. Trump higher on mental physical fitness compared to Biden. This was pre-debate. Talk about these numbers.
And we're trying to get a read about what the kind of baseline is going into the debate. Once again, we thought fitness was going to be the critical factor in assessing the debate, and was incumbent upon President Biden to perform well on those attributes. And what we find is Trump performs better than Biden. And what we'll see ultimately in the numbers post-debate is that Biden performs poorly relative to the baseline.
Before we get to that, because you broke it down by mental fitness, where the former president performs better, physical fitness, again, the former president performing better. This is interesting. His emotional fitness to be president.
Well, it's basically even, right?
Yeah.
It's ultimately a technical tie, but on the physical side and ultimately the mental side, Biden has a deficit, or went into the debates with a deficit relative to Trump.
All right, here is post-debate. President Biden's mental physical fitness to be president declines after the debate. His mental fitness to be president, this color blue is pre-debate. It was 27%. It declines to 20% post-debate on his mental fitness. Physical fitness, 21% before the debate, declines to 15% post-debate.
Yeah, once again, it's in the numbers. It suggests that he did not perform well. He wasn't competent on those key attributes that were important, which is fitness. And these are pretty large differences in such a short amount of time. By the way, we interviewed the same people before and after. It wasn't two completely separate samples. We're tracking the same individuals pre and post. And so in my estimate as an expert, they're pretty big effects.
Clifford Young is president of Ipsos Polling and Societal Trends on C-SPAN's Washington Journal program this morning. Senator Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware, national co-chair of the Biden-Harris re-election campaign, was interviewed this morning on CNN, suggesting President Biden engage in more unscripted moments interacting with voters.
I've known Joe Biden 30 years. Nobody does better than Joe at working a fire station, a union hall, a coffee shop. He was at a Waffle House later that night in Atlanta. He worked the crowd at the Raleigh event. He's had several events in New York in the last few days. I agree with E.J. Dionne that we need to remind the American people of who Joe Biden is. A strong and capable president with an incredible record and a good heart who can tell the truth and get the job done, in sharp contrast to who Donald Trump is, a man who on that stage just spewed chaos, anger, vengeance, and lies, which reflects how he led as president. I'll remind you, Casey, Donald Trump's own vice president, chief of staff, secretary of defense, national security advisor, all won't support him and say he shouldn't be let back into the White House. I hope we spend as much time focusing on that as the parlor game of will he or won't he in the days to come.
Sir, do you think that the people around President Biden let him down by not putting him out there more ahead of this so that maybe this wouldn't feel like such a shock?
Look, I've been encouraging more unscheduled, casual engagements with folks, and we've seen more of that in the last couple of weeks. I do think that part of the challenge of being president, and this is true for many presidents, is that the demands of the job mean you're often in small group settings. Very few of us got to see him in the room at the G7, for example, just last week with world leaders. But I spoke to our ambassador to Italy, a dear friend of mine, the former governor of Delaware, who was in the room with him. And I said, did you see anything like that alleged moment of mental loss of acuity? He said, no, he was sharp, he was engaged, he was commanding. We don't often see him in that setting. What we may see, and you showed it, is a compelling speech on the beach in Normandy or that engaging speech in North Carolina. But I'll share with you the criticism some have raised with me when I make that point. He's got a teleprompter. He's well prepared. We do need to see more unscripted and off-the-record moments. That is something I'm encouraging, yes.
Senator Chris Coons, Democrat from Delaware, interviewed on CNN this morning. Congressman Byron Donalds, Republican from Florida, who's been talked about as a possible vice presidential running mate to Donald Trump, was on Fox News this morning.
I know you have to say you think Donald Trump's going to win, but there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily voting for Joe Biden or Gretchen Whitmer. They're just voting against Donald Trump. You think some people think a younger Democrat could win because it's anybody but Trump. You don't see anything to that notion.
Well, I think that if you look at recent polling that came out around that question, it doesn't really matter who the Democrats pick, they all lose. When you go down that ladder, Gretchen Whitmer, et cetera, the margin is even wider. And so that's what I'm saying. At the end of the day, I don't really think it's going to matter one way or the other. The biggest concern is that Joe Biden is president now. It is crystal clear. Everybody is concerned. Can he do that job for 4 more years? That answer is no. People are concerned, can he do that job for 4 more months? That's the bigger question right now. And this is because the Democrats have decided that they chose party power over doing what is right for the country. It is clear that is the case. So, I mean, look, like I said, they might be able to explain it better, but it doesn't matter. The agenda items will remain the same.
Do you think that the ticket will be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris when it's all said and done, Congressman, or you don't think that's a possibility?
I'm not going to predict that. That's in the hands of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. They got to make that decision. I will say that if Joe Biden decides to step away and the Democrats try to step over Kamala Harris, they're going to have a bigger problem on their hands. But I'll let them deal with that. I'm just going to watch it, and we're going to go campaign and make sure that Donald Trump's the 47th president of the United States.
Congressman Byron Donalds, Republican from Florida, today on the Fox News channel. Both the House and Senate are not in session for the week for the 4th of July holiday. Story from the Washington Post. The House Judiciary Committee on Monday sued Attorney General Merrick Garland to get audio recordings of Special Counsel Robert K. Hur's interview with President Biden. The lawsuit, which was filed in federal district court in D.C., is the House GOP's latest effort to obtain tapes of an interview that Hur conducted with Biden last year as part of the investigation into the president's handling of classified documents. Hur eventually decided there was not enough evidence to bring criminal charges, though his report scrutinized Biden's mental acuity and became an issue in the 2024 race. That was from the Washington Post. Wall Street today, the Dow up 50, NASDAQ up 146, S&P up 14. From HuffPost, President Joe Biden's new overtime regulation took effect on Monday, making more U.S. workers eligible for extra pay when they work long hours, but it faces an uncertain future due to the looming presidential election as well as legal challenges from employer groups. That was reporting from HuffPost. The acting Labor Secretary, Julie Su, posted a video.
For more than 80 years, the 40-hour work week has been a pillar of fairness for American workers. It's the promise of going home to loved ones after putting in your time, not working for endless hours for flat pay. Unfortunately, that promise has eroded over time, not on our watch. Today, our rule to restore that promise goes into effect. This rule makes sure that many of our nation's lower paid, salaried workers receive overtime protections. Starting today, roughly 1 million workers making $43,888 a year or less are newly eligible for overtime protections. And next year, the salary threshold will increase to $58,656. Then it will update every 3 years. That means more money in those workers' pockets and a little more breathing room. President Biden and I are making sure that people are paid for their time that they work and giving millions a chance to reclaim their time and share in the economic prosperity that they help create. Day in and day out, we will keep on fighting for America's workers.
Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su posting that video. More from the HuffPost article. Businesses have filed at least 3 lawsuits challenging the legitimacy of the overtime rule. On Friday, a federal judge granted a narrow injunction request blocking the regulation from taking effect for workers employed by the state of Texas. But a judge in a different case could grant a more sweeping injunction as early as this week, temporarily blocking it from being applied anywhere in the country. That's precisely what happened when former President Barack Obama tried to expand overtime protections in 2016, drawing the ire of business lobbies and Republican lawmakers. Reporting from HuffPost. Washington Today continues in a moment.
The House will be in order.
This year, C-SPAN celebrates 45 years of covering Congress like no other. Since 1979, we've been your primary source for Capitol Hill, providing balanced, unfiltered coverage of government, taking you to where the policy's debated and decided, all with the support of America's cable companies. C-SPAN, 45 years and counting, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, writes Barron's, said Monday he expected European allies to keep up strong support for NATO despite a far-right victory in the first round of French elections. Blinken steered clear of commenting directly when asked about the triumph of Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party, but pointed more broadly to NATO's strengthening since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO holds a 75th anniversary summit in Washington next week, which comes in the shadow of criticism of the alliance from Republican presidential contender Donald Trump. That was the article from Barron's. Secretary Blinken was interviewed at the Brookings Institution in Washington by Suzanne Maloney, the group's foreign policy program vice president and director.
You've obviously done a lot to both rely upon and invest in the transatlantic relationship in managing both the challenge of Ukraine and the larger challenge of Russia. That is a relationship that's underpinned by a long history, deep mutual interests, but also some sense of shared values. How do you, sort of look at the future of that relationship at a time where we do see the rise of right-wing parties and their potential impact on the viability of that alliance and the effectiveness of that alliance? We've just seen the results of the first round of elections in France, a country that you know well. How concerned are you about changing trends of populism and right-wing governments that might come to the fore in Europe?
So I think first, again, to put things in focus, just looking at the state of the alliance itself, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We'll have a 75th anniversary party here in Washington in a week's time. And of course, we want to celebrate 75 years of the most successful defensive alliance in history. But the main purpose is to focus on the way forward for this alliance. And I think it's a very opportune time to remind people of why NATO matters, why it's so important, and why the investments that we and so many other countries are making in it make a difference. And it really comes back to something very basic that was at the heart of the formation of the alliance to begin with, and that's the power of collective defense. The power of Article 5 that says an attack on one is an attack on all is the strongest possible deterrent to aggression, the strongest and most effective way to prevent war in the first place, to avoid conflict in the first place, because any would-be aggressor knows that an attack on any one member means they're going to have to deal with every member of the alliance. And so I think reminding all of our citizens of the importance of that and how it's been so successful for 75 years and how it remains foundational to our security going forward is an important moment. We have an alliance that is bigger than it was just a few years ago, now 32 members, Finland and Sweden, that I think for most people that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. We have an alliance that's stronger and has greater investment in it than it's ever had. We now have 23 countries that are meeting the 2% of GDP committed to defense mark that was set at the Wales Summit back in 2014. There were just 9 countries in 2021 that met the mark. We're now at 23. An 18% increase in defense investment by the allies across the alliance. And also things that people in this room know very well, but that may be a little bit harder to translate for so many of our citizens. A very deliberate and effective effort to make sure that the alliance in its plans, in its programs, in its posture, was effectively positioned to deal with the threats of this moment. And you'll see more of that at the summit. Those plans are now in place. They're being resourced, and the alliance is moving to make sure that we have the right defenses across the alliance where they're needed, where they're mattered. So this has been a clear trajectory for the last 3.5 years. I don't actually see that changing, irrespective of the politics of the moment in Europe. We have very strong allies, very strong partners. We just came from Italy, where Italy has played a major and very effective role in continuing to strengthen the alliance. I think you've heard affirmations from various political parties in Europe of their ongoing commitment to it, irrespective of where they're coming from. So I have confidence that we'll continue to carry that forward. And the reason, again, for that is because it's manifestly in the interests of the people that all of us have to represent.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Story from Reuters. Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia said on Monday that the Ukrainian crisis cannot be solved in one day when asked about U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump's frequent claims that he could end the war within 24 hours if reelected. Republican candidate Trump has not given any details and has said that if there had been a real president, his words, in the U.S. who was respected by Russian President Vladimir Putin, that Moscow would not have invaded Ukraine in February 2022. That was the story from Reuters. The Russian ambassador held a news conference at the UN in New York City.
Donald Trump has said that if he is elected, he can solve the Ukraine crisis in one day.
We heard it before.
What's your reaction to that? And on a broader question, we've all seen a growing geopolitical divide between Russia, China, North Korea, the U.S. and European and Western allies. which of course has ramifications here as well as in many other institutions. Do you see any way of closing this growing divide?
The Ukrainian crisis cannot be solved in one day. That's objective. President Putin recently said where we are in the Ukrainian crisis as of today. It could have been solved, as you are well aware, in April 2022 in Istanbul, where we were very close to an agreement. But then Western sponsors of Ukraine interfered, in particular Boris Johnson, who told the Kyiv regime to continue fighting Russia. There was a Bucha provocation that was formally the reason for them to exit the negotiations and the agreement that was 95% ready. Now Zelensky and the regime are running around with his so-called peace plan, which is of course not a peace plan but a joke. They had a conference in Bürgenstock, as you know, which was a failure, and it is not being very much commented because it was a failure, but it is being recognized by all serious observers. President Putin, speaking recently, as recent as 14th of June, said that the reality has changed, and we are ready anytime, not just to interrupt the conflict, but to come to ending it. But the reality should be taken into account, the new one that emerged during the period between April 22 and July 24. It was rejected by Kyiv and by the West, but the problem for them is that the longer this thing continues and the more difficult the situation on the ground for them will be, the realities will be changing with that as well.
The Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, at a news conference at the UN in New York City. The news conference was called to discuss the UN Security Council's agenda for July. Russia has the rotating presidency of the council for this month. New York Times story, Ukraine's security service said on Monday that it had foiled yet another Russian plot to stir public unrest and then used the ensuing turmoil to topple the government, outlining a familiar tactic that Kyiv claims has been employed in a string of coup attempts in recent years. From Voice of America, U.S. military bases and personnel across Europe are on heightened alert after new intelligence warned of a possible terror attack targeting either facilities or personnel. U.S. defense official Monday confirmed to VOA that military installations across U.S. European Command have been elevated to Force Protection Condition Charlie, which means an attack of some sort is likely. That was from Voice of America. In Washington, the State Department deputy spokesperson Vedant Patel was asked about U.S. diplomatic facilities.
U.S. bases in Europe were put on heightened alert over the weekend. Are there any concerns about U.S. citizens there, or is this limited to military personnel, or is there any increased danger?
So on installations, I will let my colleagues at the Department of Defense speak to any posture change or anything as it relates to their facilities. What I can say about our embassies and consulate is that there has been no change in operating status of missions in the region. We, of course, closely monitor and evaluate threat information and adjust our security and operating postures accordingly. I will also say that we have a pretty strong track record of adjusting our operating procedures swiftly when needed. So I just don't have any assessment to offer at this time. Like I said, our diplomatic facilities continue to be under the same posture that they were.
State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel at his news conference in Washington. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter word for word, and you'll get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.